Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. There is something almost conspiratorial about the place where the Garden of the Earthly Delights now hangs. You'll not find it in a hushed London gallery or a Parisian temple of art, but in the vast echoing corridors of the Museo del Prado. Madrid in itself, and I first went there in 1992 and saw this painting for the first time in 1992, actually feels like it's a fitting home. It's a city of grand boulevards and imperial memory. And the Prado, with its long shadowed halls and deep red walls, carries the quiet authority of a former royal collection. This isn't a museum assembled for the public in the modern sense. It's an old treasury, once private, once dynastic, shaped by the taste of kings. The building itself began life in the late 18th century under Juan de Villanueva, designed originally not as a gallery, but as a cabinet of natural history. It was only in 1819, under Ferdinand VII of Spain, that it became the museum that we actually recognize today. And even then, what it housed was not merely art, but the accumulated eye of empire, the choices of monarchs who believed, very sincerely, that they were the custodians of civilization itself. And among those monarchs, none looms larger in this story than Philippe II of Spain. Philippe was not a man easily given to whim. He was austere, he was deeply religious, and by most accounts rather severe. Yet, he was absolutely fascinated, almost obsessively so, by the work of Hieronymus Bosch. And that alone should give us pause, because Bosch isn't at first glance the sort of painter that one associates with rigid Catholic orthodoxy. His worlds are very strange, they're very unstable, and they're filled with creatures that seem to have crawled out of our nightmares. And yet, Philip collected him. He acquired the Garden of Earthly Delights and installed it, not in a public hall, but in the private seclusion of the monastery of El Escorial, that vast granite complex just outside Madrid, where he withdrew from the world. There, surrounded by silence and ritual, this most unsettling of paintings became an object of contemplation. And I actually wondered originally what he saw in it, because to stand before the painting today is to experience something that feels less like viewing art and more like encountering a puzzle whose pieces refuse to settle. It's not a single image, but a triptych, 3 panels that unfold like a narrative, though not one that yields easily to any kind of interpretation. On the left is paradise, on the right is hell, and in the center, something altogether more ambiguous. But let me begin, as Bosch does, at the very beginning. The left panel appears at first glance almost conventional. God presents Eve to Adam in a lush, verdant landscape. There are animals, recognizable and otherwise, kind of wandering through a world that feels newly made. And it's very much a moment of origin, of innocence, of divine order. But even here, something's not quite right. If you look a little bit closer, and the animals begin to shift into something stranger, creatures hybridize, birds with unnatural proportions, beasts that feel assembled rather than born. A fountain rises in the background, delicate and improbable, like a structure from another world. The colors are way too vivid, the forms too precise. It is paradise, yes, but a paradise already tinged with a little bit of unease. Then your eye moves naturally to the center panel. This is where Bosch abandons any pretense of simplicity. The scene actually explodes into life. Hundreds of figures, perhaps thousands, spread across a vast landscape. They're naked, unashamed, and engaged in acts that range from the playful to the deeply peculiar. They ride animals, they crawl into fruit, they balance on improbable structures, they interact with objects that seem to have no clear purpose. And at first glance, you think it's a celebration, a world of pleasure, of abundance, of human freedom, very much unrestrained. But the longer you look, the less comfortable it becomes. There's no hierarchy here. There's no sense of order. The figures don't seem to relate to one another in any meaningful way. They're absorbed in their own actions, their own desires, their own fleeting experiences. It's a world without consequence and therefore perhaps without meaning. Look, some scholars have read this as a vision of humanity before the fall, if you like, a kind of alternative Eden in which desire is not yet a sin. Others see it as a warning, a depiction of what happens when humanity absorbs restraint. And then there's the third group, suggests something more radical still, that Bosch isn't offering a moral at all, but a meditation on the strangeness of existence itself. I'm kind of in that camp. And then, inevitably, your gaze is pulled to the right panel, which is hell. But not the hell of fire and brimstone that we have come to expect from the Catholic Church. Bosch's hell is colder, it's darker, it's more mechanical. It's definitely a place of punishment, but also of real absurdity. There are instruments of torture. They're fashioned from everyday objects. Musical instruments loom as devices of torment. Bodies are twisted, consumed, they're transformed. There's a very famous figure here, often called the Tree Man, which is a hollowed-out body with a face that seems disturbingly to look directly back at you, no matter where you stand when you're viewing the picture. Some historians have suggested it's Bosch himself. Whether or not that's true, I think the effect is unsettling in the extreme. This isn't a distant, abstract hell. It's very intimate. It's very personal. And threaded through all of that is a sense of inversion. And threaded through it all is a sense of inversion. The pleasures of the central panel reappear here, but they're corrupted, turned against those who indulged in them, if you like. Music becomes very much noise. Food becomes excess. Desire becomes punishment. So what then is Bosch actually telling us? And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. For centuries, viewers of this particular painting have tried to decode the painting as a moral allegory. Paradise, humanity's fall into sin, and of course, the inevitable descent into hell. A very neat progression on 3 very neat panels, a warning perhaps to a deeply religious audience. But the painting resists such neatness. There's no clear moment of transition. No fall is depicted. There's no single act of disobedience that explains the movement from innocence to chaos to hell. Instead, the panels seem to exist in a kind of very uneasy relationship. Less, I think, a linear story than a set of possibilities. And this is where the real mystery deepens, because Bosch leaves no written explanation, no diary, no notes, no commentary that might guide us. We're left as viewers to navigate the imagery ourselves, to construct meaning from fragments that never quite cohere. And I think that's actually the point. This isn't a painting that tells you what to think. It's a painting that forces you to confront uncertainty, to recognize that meaning is not fixed, but contingent, shifting, dependent on each individual perspective. And in that sense, To me, that almost feels very modern. There's also the question of its sheer originality. When Bosch painted this in the late 15th or early 16th century, nothing like this existed anywhere. The Renaissance was unfolding with its emphasis on proportion, on harmony, and the rediscovery of, classical ideas. And here was Bosch creating something that seemed to belong to another universe entirely. He's often described as a medieval painter, and in some ways I think that's true, but there's something in his work that anticipates, I think, much later movements. Surrealism, for a start. Even aspects of modern psychological art. Artists like Dali would later look back to Bosch as a kind of precursor, a man who had already begun to explore the landscapes of the unconscious. And yet Bosch isn't painting dreams in the modern sense. He was painting a world in which boundaries between the real and the imagined were more fluid, where symbolism carried weight, where images could operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Which, of course, brings me back to Philippe II. Why would such a man, so controlled, so devout, be drawn to such a painting? I think the answer is that he saw it as a warning, a vivid, unforgettable depiction of the consequences of sin. If you like, a tool for reflection, for, I guess, moral contemplation. And in the quiet, in the deathly silence of El Escorial, this riotous, unsettling work, I think it becomes something else entirely, a mirror in which the viewer confronts their own nature. And I think that's what he was doing. But here's the thing, there is another possibility, that Philip, like us, recognized that the painting doesn't resolve itself, that it opens questions rather than closing them, that it offers not certainty, but complexity. And I think that's perhaps why the Garden of Earthly Delights endures as one of my favorite and one of the greatest paintings in the world. Not because it's beautiful, although it is in a weird way, not because it's technically brilliant, which it absolutely is, but because it refuses to be finished. It leaves so many unanswered questions. 600 years later, it still resists us, doesn't it? It still invites interpretation. It still unsettles us when we sit and watch it. You stand or sit before it in the Prado, surrounded by the weight of history. Philippe II of Spain, actually held this picture. So there's echoes of empire, the quiet authority of centuries. And yet the painting feels alive in a way that very few others do. It shifts as you look at it. Details emerge. Meanings suggest themselves, and of course then they dissolve, which keeps you coming back. It's not a relic. It's definitely a conversation to be had. And like all the best conversations, it leaves you with more questions than answers. What is paradise? What is pleasure? What is punishment? And perhaps I think the most unsettling question of all, where exactly do we stand within it? Madrid is absolutely one of my favorite cities, and if you ever go, please go and see this painting. You'll be moved by it, and I guarantee you'll have more questions than you will answers. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.